If someone told you that two boys were thrown out of a mansion just because they didn't look perfect, would you believe them? What if I told you those same boys, once ridiculed for their crooked teeth and messy hair, would grow up to silence every cruel voice, not with revenge, but with something far more powerful? This is not just a story about wealth. It's a story about love, loss, and in the kind of bond only twins can share when the world walks away. It wasn't the thunder that scared them. It was the silence that came after. The kind of silence that wrapped around two 6-year-old boys standing in front of a mansion that used to mean everything and now meant absolutely nothing. Rain soaked through their hand-me-down sweaters and their shoes, 2 sizes too big, squished with every step. They didn't shiver, not from cold, but from something colder, the knowledge that they no longer belonged. Eli and Ezra had been born in that house, under chandeliers they never touched, and portraits of ancestors who never smiled at them. Their mother, Margaret Whitmore, had loved them fiercely, but her love was never loud enough to drown the whispers about their father, a man who painted murals and didn't come from money. When Margaret died suddenly in a car crash, the house changed. So did the people in it. Their grandfather, Everett Whitmore, was a man of wealth and legacy, but not of heart. The day after the funeral, he summoned the boys to the foyer, grand marble under their muddy shoes, son, and stared at them like a blemish on a family crest. "You carry her face," he muttered, "but not her worth." They didn't understand his words, but they understood his orders. The butler didn't look them in the eyes as he handed them 2 small brown paper bags, each containing a bruised apple, a dry sandwich, and an envelope with $20. No suitcase, no goodbye note, no explanation. The front gate groaned open under the weight of the rain, and before the boys could ask where they were going, it clanged shut behind them. They waited. Maybe someone would come. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe their mother would walk down the driveway, calling their names like she used to when she found them hiding in the linen closet. But no voice came, only the rain, only the growing ache in their stomachs. Ezra, the quieter twin, took Eli's hand and said something their mother once told them when storms frightened them at night. "Close your eyes. The rain can't find you if you don't look scared." Eli closed his eyes, not because he believed it, but because he needed to believe Ezra did. Somewhere behind the hedges, the old gardener, Mr. Howard, watched from his shed. He had trimmed the roses for Margaret on the morning of her wedding. He remembered how she danced barefoot in the garden after the twins were born, whispering, "They're mine, no matter what anyone says." That night, against his better judgment, he wrapped 2 old wool blankets in plastic and placed them by the road, along with a small flask of hot tea. He didn't say a word to anyone, but he couldn't let them freeze. The boys didn't speak much as they walked, only stopping when Ezra's feet bled and Eli found a bench under a gas station awning. They shared the apple, shared the blanket, and shared the silence of children who had just learned what it meant to be unwanted. They tried to tell people who they were. "We're Whitmores," Eli once said to a woman outside a bakery. She laughed. "Whitmores don't look like you," she said, eyes scanning their dark curls and dirt-smudged cheeks. "Try again." From that moment on, they stopped telling the truth. They stopped trying to be who they were. Instead, they became who they had to be: invisible, observant, unbreakable. And while the world looked away, something was quietly forming between them. Not anger, not bitterness, but a bond built not from blood alone, but from the vow they never said aloud. If no one wants us, we'll want each other. If the world forgets us, we'll remember who we are. It was on that rainy day, soaked, small, and nameless, that Eli and Ezra Whitmore ceased being heirs to a name and began becoming something the world would never see coming. The foster home smelled like boiled cabbage and floor wax, 2 scents that seemed to define every forgotten hallway where unwanted children waited for someone to remember they existed. Eli and Ezra arrived without fanfare, just 2 more boys with no last name anyone believed. They were assigned bunk beds in a room shared with 5 others. The mattress springs creaked, the window stuck, and the door never quite closed all the way. But none of that mattered. They still had each other. The woman in charge was named Miss Rowley, though most kids whispered other names behind her back. She wasn't cruel, but she was tired. Tired of crying children, broken promises from social workers, and stories that all started to sound the same. When she first saw the twins, she squinted. "You two look strange," she muttered. "Same face, but not quite. One of you smiles too much, the other not at all." She wasn't wrong. Eli had learned to smile early, to hide, deflect, charm his way past judgment. Ezra didn't bother. His silence was a wall, tall and deliberate, built to keep the world from asking questions he didn't want to answer. Together, they confused people. But apart, they were vulnerable. At school, the teasing came fast. It always does when children don't understand the difference and are taught to fear it. "Whose faces are you wearing?" one boy sneered. "Why does your hair look like a squirrel died on your head?" Another giggled. Ezra took it quietly. Eli laughed along, pretending it didn't hurt. But at night, when the lights were off and the blankets were pulled tight to their chins, Eli whispered, "Maybe we're hard to look at." Ezra replied, "Then let's become hard to ignore." They began collecting books from the donation bin at the corner store. Old encyclopedias, outdated science books, torn poetry collections, anything with words. Eli read them aloud with the kind of voice that made even broken sentences sound like stories. Ezra memorized facts, patterns, dates. He remembered everything, not because he needed to, but because remembering made him feel like something in this world was solid. One day, a substitute teacher noticed Ezra's notebook. Every margin was filled with chemical equations and architectural sketches. "Where'd you learn this?" she asked. Stunned, Ezra just shrugged. "My brother reads," he said. "I draw what I hear." The teacher said nothing. But that afternoon, she spoke to the principal. That conversation would later open doors neither boy knew existed yet, back at the foster home. However, talent wasn't currency, quiet meant suspicious, smart meant smart Alec. And Eli's growing ability to speak like an adult earned him more punishment than praise. "Don't act like you're better," one of the older boys snapped one night, throwing a shoe at Eli's head. "Just 'cause you sound rich don't mean you ain't trash like the rest of us." They didn't fight back. They never did. Not because they were weak, but because they had already decided. The world could push, but it wouldn't get a rise. They were building something deeper, something slower, a foundation of quiet defiance wrapped in gentleness. Miss Rowley began noticing something else. Two, the twins always shared meals, blankets, books. If Ezra got a second roll at dinner, he split it. If Eli got an extra pencil from a kind teacher, he gave it to someone else before keeping one for himself. In a place where survival often meant hoarding and snapping, their softness was strange, almost threatening, and yet, slowly, others noticed. A younger boy named Jamie, who never spoke, started sitting closer to them during story time. A girl named Lena, who used to hoard crackers under her bed, began offering them to Ezra after lunch. The twins weren't trying to lead, but they were becoming something different. Not loud, not popular, but solid, unshakable, not because of what they look like, but because of what they refused to become. They didn't have a name that the people respected. They didn't have a face that the world praised, but they had each other. They had fire disguised as kindness, and they had a quiet plan. "We won't rise to prove anything. We'll rise because we can. Because rising is what we were meant to do, even when no one's watching." It started with a single letter, folded neatly in an ivory envelope, sealed with a gold-embossed crest that looked wildly out of place against the peeling walls of the foster home. Miss Rowley squinted at the return address, lips curling slightly as if the ink itself carried an odor of old money. "From the Whitmore Foundation," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. She handed it to Ezra with a shrug. Someone out there still remembers you. But Ezra didn't open it. Not right away. Instead, he placed it on their shared desk and stared at it for 3 full days, until Eli, with a lopsided smile, said, "It's just paper. It can't hurt us more than they already did." So they opened it. Inside was an invitation, a scholarship, not just to any school, but to Westbridge Academy, the kind of place with stone archways, uniforms, and classical music echoing through the halls, a place for legacies, for bloodlines, not for boys with secondhand sneakers and a surname no one dared say aloud anymore. They didn't want to go at first, not out of fear, but out of instinct. "It's a trap," Ezra said. "They want us to remember where we don't belong." But Eli, ever the dreamer, saw something else in the letter. What if they're not the only ones watching? So they went, not with pride, not with excitement, but with quiet steps and eyes wide open. The first day at Westbridge felt like walking into a museum where everything was alive and judging. Portraits lined the hallways, none of which looked like them. Students whispered, teachers paused, some laughed behind polished hands. "Look," one boy said with a grin. The charity cases arrived. Hoped they brought a dictionary to understand the syllabus. But the twins didn't flinch. They sat in the front row, took notes, asked questions, and slowly, something strange began to happen. Eli spoke during debates with a clarity and conviction that made even professors raise their brows. Ezra submitted essays that read like they were penned by scholars twice his age. Their science project, rebuilding a miniature solar water purifier, using only recycled parts, won first prize across 3 districts. Still, the whispers didn't stop. Too smart for orphans, too confident for nobodies, too clean for the streets. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the librarian who took an interest in their reading habits and began slipping them books never listed in the curriculum. What mattered was the janitor, Mr. Langley, who used to be an engineer before a workplace accident and offered them quiet advice during lunch breaks. What mattered was the old Latin teacher who, after reading Ezra's thesis on ancient symmetry, simply said, "Don't ever let them tell you brilliance needs a name." And then in the shadows, someone else was watching too, a woman named Dr. Celeste Monroe, a board member of the Whitmore Foundation. She had read the report of 2 unknown boys being recommended by a substitute teacher years earlier. And unlike the others, she had asked, what happened to them? When she learned the truth, that they had been discarded, not for lack of merit, but for the shape of their face and the source of their blood, she made a decision. If they rise, she whispered to herself, let it be under their own names. By the time they were 16, Eli and Ezra had already won multiple state-level competitions, delivered keynote speeches at youth conferences, and started a community tutoring program at the very foster home they had once outgrown. They didn't post about it. They didn't flaunt it. They just kept doing it, because this was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming space, with grace. And while the world still hesitated to applaud them, something undeniable was forming, a reputation that needed no last name, no apology, and no explanation. At 17, most boys are still trying to figure out who they are. Eli and Ezra already knew who they weren't. They weren't victims, though the world tried to cast them that way. They weren't rebels, though they had every right to be. And they weren't anyone's charity story. They were Whitmore's, not by inheritance, but by resilience. By now, their achievements were stacking like bricks. Science awards, academic fellowships, a small tech startup they'd quietly co-founded that was helping underfunded schools digitize learning materials. They named it Mirror Bright, in honor of the nights they sat staring at the cracked mirror, wondering who they'd become. And yet, despite their growing success, there was one thing they hadn't touched: the mansion, the gate, the man who had once tossed them out like yesterday's embarrassment, Everett Whitmore. But life has a strange way of folding back on itself. One evening, As the twins prepared for a National Youth Innovation Summit, a news headline flashed across the screen in the campus library. Whitmore Holdings on the verge of collapse, seeking strategic advisors for turnaround. Ezra barely blinked. He's failing. Eli leaned closer. He won't ask for help. His pride won't allow it. But the next morning, something unthinkable happened. A letter, not from the foundation, not through a lawyer, but handwritten, signed Everett Whitmore. It was short, stiff, almost clinical. To Eli and Ezra, I have been made aware of your accomplishments. Circumstances have changed. If you are willing to consider it, I would like to invite you to Whitmore Holdings for a consultation. We are exploring new leadership structures. I believe it may be time, but for a conversation, E.W. They didn't respond right away. For a week, they walked past the envelope, letting it sit unopened on the windowsill like a relic from another life. Finally, Ezra, who had never been one for sentiment, said, "We go, but not to prove anything. We go because we've earned the right to choose." So they went. The same iron gate that had once closed behind them now opened without resistance. The same butler who had once looked through them now held the door open with eyes cast low. And Everett himself, now older, thinner, with hands that trembled ever so slightly, stood in the grand hall waiting. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." Men like him rarely do. Instead, he offered facts. The company was hemorrhaging. The board was panicking. They needed a fresh vision. "And it seems," he said quietly, "you two have become that vision." Ezra stared at the chandelier above, the same one he had stared at as a child when he was told he didn't belong. "Why now?" he asked. Everett hesitated. Then, in a rare flicker of humility, he said, "Because I was wrong about your father, about you, and maybe, because no one else is left." Eli smiled, not bitterly, but with something softer. "We'll think about it," he said. "But if we come back, it won't be under your shadow." It was the first time Everett saw not boy, but men. Men with backbone built from cold benches and cracked sidewalks. Men who had taken the name he'd tried to erase and carved it into stone. They didn't take over the company immediately. They gave it conditions, restructure, transparency, real community investment, a change of culture. "Not because we need your empire," Ezra had said, "but because you need to remember what your name was supposed to stand for." And slowly, Whitmore Holdings began to change, not through press releases or performative gestures, but through quiet revolutions in leadership, policy, and purpose. Behind it all were two brothers who never chased revenge. Only legacy, the kind that lasts. When the media finally caught wind of who was behind the sudden revival of Whitmore Holdings, the headlines weren't just intrigued, they were stunned. Twin brothers lead corporate turnaround, from orphans to empire. And the Whitmore heirs no one saw coming flooded every major outlet. But what fascinated people most wasn't the comeback story. It was the revelation that these boys had once been disowned by the very dynasty they were now saving. An old photo resurfaced, grainy, faded. Two little boys in oversized sweaters, standing in the rain outside a mansion gate. The internet did what it always does. It zoomed. It speculated. It reacted. And somewhere in the flood of tweets and commentaries, one line echoed louder than the rest. "How did we not see them coming?" The answer was simple. No one looks for beauty in broken things. No one expects strength from silence. But Eli and Ezra had never needed the world's permission to rise. They had only needed time. When they gave their first joint interview, they didn't wear luxury suits. They didn't flaunt watches or titles. They showed up in their usual way, subtle, calm, measured. "I think," Eli said to the reporter, "people confuse suffering with weakness. But we learned early that pain doesn't make you fragile. It makes you precise." Ezra added, "We're not interested in proving anyone wrong. We're interested in building something right." Sakim. What followed was a ripple effect. Their story became a case study in business schools. The Whitmore redemption, not because they returned to take revenge, but because they returned and redefined what power could look like. They dismantled the old systems inside the company that rewarded status over skill. They created full-ride internship programs for foster youth. They launched an educational fund named not after Whitmore, but after their mother, the Margaret Initiative. And when asked why, Ezra simply said, because she never got to see us become who she believed we could be. They didn't attend the high society galas. They didn't pose for magazine covers. Instead, they spent time where most CEOs wouldn't be caught dead. Public schools, community centers, battered shelters, speaking not about success, but about worth. And people listened, not just because they had money now, but because they had something rare, credibility that had been earned in silence, through humiliation, grit, and grace. At a university lecture, a student once asked, "What's your biggest regret?" Eli paused, then said, "That for years, we thought our faces were something to hide." Ezra added, "And now we know. They're the face of resilience." The world didn't just turn around. It leaned in. It paid attention. It finally realized that legacy doesn't come from bloodlines. It comes from who you choose to be when no one's watching. It was a crisp October morning when the Whitmore mansion opened its gates, not for a gala, not for investors, but for children, dozens of them, some from shelters, others from broken homes, many with eyes that had already learned too much about disappointment. They came wearing borrowed jackets and scuffed shoes, some holding tightly onto a sibling's hand, just like two boys had done years ago under the same wrought iron arch. This time, though, they were invited. Eli and Ezra stood at the top of the grand staircase, not as heirs, not as bosses, but as hosts. The mansion, once a shrine to exclusion, was now the home of the Margaret House, a nonprofit sanctuary for youth with nowhere to go. Every room had been restored, not with opulence, but with purpose. Classrooms, art studios, therapy rooms, a courtyard with a garden. The library was the heart of it all, rebuilt and renamed Howard's Library, in honor of the gardener who had once left them tea and blankets when no one else did. When the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, no press were allowed, only the people who mattered, the social workers, the teachers, the kids, the janitors who never stopped seeing light in discarded things. In the crowd stood Everett Whitmore, older now, frailer, and smaller somehow, like a man who had watched the walls he built crumble, not in shame, but in surrender. When Eli approached him, there was no bitterness in his eyes, just something softer, something finished. "You named it after her," Everett said quietly, glancing at the sign above the entrance. Ezra nodded. "Because she never stopped believing in love, even when this house forgot." Everett's lips trembled, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. Because now, the name Whitmore meant something again, not because it had been restored to power, but because it had been returned to love. Later that evening, long after the children had gone to bed and the volunteers had dimmed the lights, Eli and Ezra sat alone on the mansion steps, just like they had all those years ago. But this time, facing inward, the house no longer cast shadows, it cast warmth. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Eli whispered. Ezra looked up at the stars. "I think she always was." No applause, no headlines, just two brothers, once mocked for their faces, now known for the lives they touched. They had been abandoned by wealth, but they became something no empire could ever manufacture. Proof that love, when held tightly, even in silence, can turn the forgotten into legends. And the world watched, and for once, it had nothing to say. Sometimes, the most powerful stories don't come from palaces or podiums. They come from silence, from rain-soaked gates and whispered promises between brothers. Eli and Ezra didn't rise to take revenge. They rose to remind the world that your worth isn't written by those who abandon you. It's carved by what you choose to become. So if you've ever felt overlooked, laughed at, or left behind, let this be your reminder. The world may not be watching now, but one day it just might turn around and be left speechless by you. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional twin stories that reveal the strength behind quiet souls, because sometimes the loudest power is love that never gave up.